Okay, hopefully a few others will come in the next few minutes, but it's almost 5 minutes into the class, so let's make a start. Okay, sign your names on here. I haven't updated the list since Wednesday, so if your name isn't there, but I think everyone's been so far, so you should be on. So you've all got syllabus, either on Monday or Wednesday, yes? No one doesn't have the syllabus for the course, yeah? But at least Erdem doesn't have topic 1. Everyone else got the topic 1 sheet that we did, yes? Okay. So let me just make one change to that. I hadn't updated the date on the back, but so that's the sheet. So the first item on our agenda today is to try and get a couple more brave volunteers for presentations. At the moment, Tuje and Seda, and I need to talk to them during the break about this so we can start planning it. Tuje and Seda have volunteered bravely to present probably next week on John Locke. What I need is 2 other brave people to volunteer for one of the other texts. I will probably talk about the other 2 since we have a smallish class this time. Normally we have presentations all from students. So he says, looking over at Erdem, my old friend, are you interested in any of these guys? Right, okay. Anyone else? I will have to pick some names from the list, you see, and even if they're not here, they will in fact officially become presenters for next week, next Friday. So I prefer it if you volunteer because it's kind of fairer and democratic. No? Right. Let me do the highly complex approach to choosing student presenters, which is I close my eyes, I twiddle the pen around, at the last minute. Right, you want to do this one? Right, okay, put your names down. Okay, this is my sheet. If you put both your names against there, okay. That was like when they used to execute people and then there was a reprieve just at the last minute or something. I was about to poke on someone's name. So Jan Berk was brave, saved someone else the torture or something.
I don't know his surname.
Right, well we can find out his surname. Is he, I don't suppose there's another fair hat in the class, but according to this, it must be Özkan, special blood. Is that right? So let me put that down as well. Okay, so do you know if Fairhat is going to come today or not? You don't know, okay. I will speak to the 3 of you, maybe in the break, okay, for a few minutes. We need to make a time, see if it's suitable to meet me maybe on Tuesday next week when I officially have office hours, okay, so that we can start to plan the presentations, and then I'll give you a little guidance so you can start preparing and doing some work at the weekend as well. Okay, we don't want to leave it until the last minute because that wouldn't be good. Okay, right, here is the, did I give this out? I've given this out. No, this is the second one. So I think that's enough. With a class of about 15 people, with 4 people per topic, with a bit of extra pushing and shoving here and there, I think we'll get through the semesters. So Jan Berk and Ferhat will talk about Filmer, and Tuje and Seda will talk about Locke, and therefore David Bay will talk about, so I usually say Hodger, but at the library they always call me David Bay, so I've got into habit of becoming a Bay suddenly. But David will talk about Bosway and Hobbes at some point next week as well. We'll work out the times and so on together. Okay, very quickly then, we don't need this. Let us recap on what we've been looking at so far. I have to wait for this thing to twiddle around before we carry on. Oh no. We're looking at the 17th and 18th centuries, a period when some monarchs, some kings tried to be absolute, and other people revolted, resisted those attempts. Okay, we're going to look at the nature of politics very briefly during that period. And 17th, 18th centuries, monarchy and resistance, as we said, and look at some ideas, some intellectual reactions, responses to that. We started then looking at what is political philosophy. We talked about polis, the city-states, and how it was this discussion of what how the polis, the city-state, should be organized, but it means something more today. Then we talked about three approaches during this period to understanding political power, political authority. Divine right, which is, which one? Coming from gods, okay? The idea that the God, in this case, because people are monotheistic, gives the power to the king or queen or whoever it might be, okay? Secondly, political authority based on contract or covenant, which is agreement, okay? That's some kind of agreement between some people, everyone, some part of everyone, the king and everyone, whatever it is. We'll discuss different versions of this, including when we look at Locke. Creates or gives up power and gives that power to someone else. And then lastly, but we're not looking at this in detail here, the idea of law as the basis for political power as well. But we'll be focusing on Filmer and Bosway there, and then Hobbes and Locke there. Okay, let's move on now into what I've called absolute monarchy in theory and in practice. Does anyone know what this picture is? Anyone seen this quite famous picture before? Yes. Yeah, okay, good. That's absolutely right. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, one of the texts that I will be talking about briefly and then in more detail next week. This is the sort of image from that. I don't have my copy here, otherwise I could hold it up and show you the same picture. Okay. Here is a king who in fact looks very, very similar to Charles I, who was the King of England who was killed as a result of the English Civil War, with the nice long hair and the little goatee beard and things like that. And the people, this scattered image, which you may not be able to see, is actually sort of human beings. Okay, he makes up the body, the Leviathan there, in a sense, and he's got his images of power and so on, and he's looking over the country there. Okay, so this is the idea of monarchical power and so on. Okay, let's go back, say a little bit more of what we've been talking about, but kind of in a slightly more detail, okay, to start us off. Very, very slowly. Divine right theory of kingship, basic principles. Okay, can anyone remind us then, we said briefly before, the young gentleman there answered the question, but can anyone remind us what I've said divine right theory of kingship is, the basic ideas? Say again, the key concept is that power comes from God, okay? God gives the power, okay, to the king in some way. It might be directly, or we might come up with some ideas which show it going in other ways. So let's just represent this first. God, and then king, and we have that, okay? Very simple image, but it's a good starting point, okay? If you are religious, and if you are a believer in a monotheistic religion, if you believe in one God, which in the 17th, 18th centuries in Europe was the dominant form, of course, various types of Christianity, then for you there is one God, there is one source of power in the universe. Okay? The source of everything is God. And therefore, obviously, even political power ultimately comes from God, because everything in that sense comes from God. But we go beyond that. This is more a detailed, a more specific point that they're trying to make. Okay? But on the one level, ultimately, God is the source of everything, good and evil, however you put it. Okay? And this is part of it. If the image of the universe is based on monos, one, remember in Greek, for us, monotheism, one God, there is one God, then it's perhaps not unnatural for people also to think politically in terms of monos, in terms of monarchy, okay, one power or something like that. So if you have power beginning with one God, then the power somehow reaches the king or whoever, and that should be one person as well. So there's a kind of connection there, okay, this thinking of one God giving power to one person. So we have the ultimate God giving everything to the universe, and then we have this idea of one God giving one king power. So whenever you get discussions of divine right, in most cases it's looking at kings, okay? It's not looking at parliaments and saying parliament gets its power from God, though that is something which is discussed. But most discussion, and when we look at Filmer and Bosway, they're not talking about where parliaments get their power from. They're concerned with the monarch getting his power from the monotheistic God, okay? So there is this kind of one thinking going on in a sense. I'm not suggesting that if you're monotheistic you have to support monarchy. You can be democratic, republican or something, but I'm saying we might think of this connection there in a sense, okay? Single, undivided God, single, undivided political power. It's kind of the same thing. So you can't split things up. You can't give bits of the power away to other people because it comes from God in that sense. So God gives the power to the king. That means, in most arguments, the king is responsible back to God, okay? If I give my pen to Erdem and say, give it back to me in 2 seconds, he's responsible for giving it back to me in 2 seconds, okay? It's a thing between us. The rest of you are not involved in that at all. This is a relationship between me and him. I've given him something, and in return he gives me the same thing or something else, but the responsibility is to do what I say in this case. So it's kind of similar here. Most people who believed in divine right kingship believed that the king was not responsible to the people. You could not criticize me. You could not complain about me, okay? Because the power I'm using comes from God, not from you. So the relationship is this way and then that way, down and then up, okay, here. The people are down here, and they're outside of that, okay. So very often, most writers in this way represent that, okay. Power comes from God to the king, directly or in another way, but the responsibility of the king, if he does something bad, he'll be punished by God, okay. God will damn him forever in hell if he's a bad king. Okay, that's the job of God. That's his part of the sort of deal. It's nothing to do with you lot. I rule you. If I mistreat you all as a bad king, it's God who will punish me in that sense. It's putting it a bit simplistically, but that's basically the idea, and we'll see that in some of our thinkers as we look in more detail. However, we should stress that it doesn't mean necessarily that the king's power is arbitrary. Anyone know what that word means? Arbitrary power? If I am the king, Davut Kral, and I have absolute power coming from God and so on, does that make my power arbitrary? Do you know what arbitrary means? If something happens arbitrarily, what does that mean? Anyone wish to have a stab at this, have a go? Basically it means anything can happen, or in this case, the king can do whatever he wants. Okay, there's no kind of law or control over it. Okay, most of our lives are not arbitrary. We're governed by physical laws, human laws, and things like that. Okay, but sometimes things happen arbitrarily. There's no control over them or whatever. In this case, it means the king has total power from God to do whatever he wants. These people would argue because of this side, because the king is responsible to God, he cannot behave arbitrarily. He cannot misuse his power. Okay, so that's the basic situation there. God presenting the power to the king, Okay, the king is responsible back to God. The people are outside of that deal, but it should not be an arbitrary power. It should be something that is carefully controlled. It should be specially done. I've got something directly from God. Okay, my power is sacred. My power is part of God, so I should use that carefully. So most thinkers don't just say, God gives the power to the king, therefore he can do what he wants. Okay, and we'll talk a bit more about absolutism and talk about the same point again. It doesn't necessarily mean arbitrary power in that sense. Okay, let's just briefly talk about our two guys, and now we have Jamberg and Ferhat will be talking about Robert Filmer. We don't have a picture of him. This is Bosway. We'll say a little bit about him in a minute. But let's say a little bit about Filmer's version of this without saying too much, because I want, obviously, to have their perspective next week, and I'll help them with that. Filmer lived from the end of the 16th to the middle of the 17th century, although his book, which, as you've seen on the bibliography, Patriarcha, okay, was published in 1680, which means it was a posthumous publication. What does that mean? Do you know what posthumous means? Like the word to add to your mental look. If something is done posthumously, after his death, okay, because he died 1653 and it was almost 30 years later. So if you describe something or something as posthumous, it means after someone's death, okay. Not important for this, but you can remember that point for the future. So he was writing at a certain time, but his book was not made widely known until quite a long time later on, okay. It's not such a big deal for us, but it's worth mentioning. Okay, understanding his version of this, we need first to look at his title. Now, the arch bit is like the arch bit here, meaning power or something like that, archos in ancient Greek. It's the patri bit that we want to look at. Anyone know any Greek or Latin? I've probably asked that question before. Anyone know what the word pater might mean in those? There is a word in Turkish, is it pider or pidar? Comes from Persian, in fact. Is it pider, pidar? Instead of saying baba, is it er? Okay. Thank you, Hojam. Pider. So that's, what does that mean? Is it E or A? A. I did it right the first time. Okay. I sometimes have a problem with vowels in Turkish. No? E.
The second letter is
E.
Instead of I, you have to put E.
Ah, pe.
For
Oh.
A, it's E also.
So it's peder. Right, okay, all right, okay. Let's blah, 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 blah. Talk amongst yourselves, people on the internet. We'll just try and get this one sorted out. These words are what I would call cognate, which means they have the same origin because they look very similar. Okay, we've got ignore vowels. Vowels are changing all the time in languages. D's and T's, well, you have things like Murad and Murat in Turkish, so already D and T is a flexible thing. Basically, that's the same Indo-European word. It's in fact the same word as this, except we've turned the d-t into a th, and we've got f instead of p. But in fact, also, it's a cognate. It goes back to an ancient Indo-European language. Pater means father. In Turkish, when do you use peder? Because most of the time, everyone says baba. Is it more formal, or what is the deal there? I've never understood why you've got baba, which is the kind of... In English, we have father and dad, and daddy. Okay, my son, he's 5 soon, but now he wants to call me dad, not daddy. Okay, daddy is the very baby thing, so I'm dad. And maybe one day he will call me father, I don't know. But in Turkish, baba is kind of used across the board. Babies, little kids, students, everyone has a baba in that sense. So when would you use that word peder? Would anyone use that word, or is it just written in Ottoman and things like that, maybe? How would you understand that word? Does it have a special meaning, or? No? Right, okay. Just trying to learn something here myself, actually, wasting time. But the main point is patriarcha means the power of the father. Okay, father power.
Christian clerics.
Okay, Catholic priests are father this and father that, so they would say peder for that, would they? Okay, father in that sense. 2J's looking a little bit dubious about that interpretation. But anyway, let's leave it for the moment. The main point is that the word pater, which is the basis of patriarcha, comes from the word pater, okay, which means father. So, what Filmer argued is that, yes, God is the source of the power, but his source of power, he would call it paternal power, fatherly power. I don't know whether you could say babala in Turkish. Would that make any sense? There's something of the fathers or something like that. Okay, so God is the source of power because he created Adam, the first man. Okay, the first human being, and in this case, more importantly, the first male human being. And Adam was the first father. Rather, you concentrated on me. Thanks. So, God creates Adam and gives him power over his children. Okay? And Adam's power, therefore, is paternal power. Then, to use the English, the same word we've had before, after Adam in the Old Testament, in the old part, the Jewish part of the Bible, you have ruling guys who are called patriarchs in English, okay? They are father rulers. People like Moses or Ibrahim, they are all called patriarchs. They have power, and they are also described genealogically with their children and so on. So they are ruling their tribe, their extended family, as a kind of big father, okay? So we'll put the pats in here, okay? Ruling smaller groups, not ruling all human beings, which is what Adam did, because obviously there weren't many then. So here we have a slightly more complicated thing. God creates Adam, gives him paternal or patriarchal power over his children. The later patriarchs have similar power, and then the modern kings are effectively the inheritors, the results of that. Okay. So in the same way that Adam had paternal power over his family, or that patriarchs had power over their families and tribes, so kings have a kind of paternal power over their countries. Okay, not over all of humanity. Okay, we've got lots of different kings now. It's not like Adam, but the power they have in their country is very similar. It's the same idea, and it ultimately comes from God through this chain, through this development, in a way. And they use their power and behave in a paternal way. Okay, just as, okay, I'm a baba, as we said before, just as I am a father and I love my children and I want them to do well. Sometimes I get angry with them when my son runs across the road when I've said, please wait for me, or something like that. It's out of the love I have, in a sense, for him, and I want them to learn how to read and write and learn about dinosaurs and all these things. So in that way, kings are also the fathers, not biologically, but in a non-biological way. They're also the fathers of their countries, and they should love the subjects, and they should want them to do well in the way that a virtual father, literal father, does as well. Okay, so it's not just this chain which we could describe as paternal, but also the way they use the power, how they have that power, the way they behave. Okay, they should behave in this loving, fatherly kind of way. So you can see that we've got a slight difference between, in a way, what we describe here and what we get here, but it's the same basic idea. Okay, there is this chain. Ultimately, God is the source of power, but here we've got this paternal element getting mixed in a sense. Okay, any questions there? Is that all clear? And as we said, Jan-Berk and Ferhat will read it all soon, discuss with me, and then explain some of these ideas, hopefully in more detail, next Friday. Okay, our second example of divine right theory is this gentleman here, Jacques-Ménine Bossuet, who lived a little bit later than Filmer, okay, born in the first third of the 17th century and died at the beginning of the 18th century. And what did we say about him? What did I say about his life? I gave one piece of information about him last class. What kind of person was he? And I don't mean kind of what kind of chai did he like or something like that, but about his position in life. Can anyone remember?
Yeah, really good to feel.
Yeah, his ideas are similar but a bit different. But I mean, what in him in his life, what I said one thing about Bossuet. He's a bishop, okay? Évêque here in French means bishop. So he would be, you could call him a père, Father Bossuet, or Father Jacques-Ménine, they might say, or something like that, père in French. And his book, as we said, is called Politics Taken from the Very Word of Holy Scripture, from the Bible. Okay, Filmer does the same thing. Most of the supporting evidence that they use is based upon the Bible. Okay, now we wouldn't do that so much these days. Well, obviously not in Turkey, where most people are Muslims anyway, where you might use the Quran as the basis for an argument but in general, we would not use the Bible as the basis for arguments about politics these days. But for them, it was natural, okay? It was part of their life. God was real, it was an important part of their life, and so on. And as an important member of the religious hierarchy, we'll say more about his life next week, it's quite natural for him to find evidence from the Word of God about politics. Okay, so we even have, let's put in here, perhaps we can say, the Word of God is giving us the ideas in a way, okay, and that's for them a natural thing. Everything comes from God in that sense, okay. Okay, he has similar ideas to this basic pattern, and we'll see some of those, and he talks about paternal power and things as well, so I won't go into too much detail here. A couple of things worth mentioning. He talks about God and kings. One of the things I've always found interesting, he talks about God, kings as the ministers of God. Now, what does the English word minister mean? Anyone know that one? Yeah, in politics, for example, you have the prime minister or the president, okay, and then you have the people running separate departments, separate sections of the government, and they are the ministers. They do things on behalf of the president or the prime minister, which means the first minister in a sense, okay. And kings had their own ministers who worked for them because the kings can't do everything. So God, kind of in a sense, is the ultimate power, and the kings are, it's almost like a job, therefore. They're like ministers, paid employees to work for God. They get power from him and they use that power on his behalf, which again reminds us of this responsibility thing, okay? It's a formal relationship. If you are the minister of someone, then you have meetings with them, they find out what you're doing and things like that, and it's a similar kind of thing here, okay? So they are the workers for God on earth. They're doing his work on earth. The other thing he says is that because of this and how they get the power, kings are sacred. Do you know what that word means? If something is sacred? Holy, okay. And I mean here, holy in a religious sense, not something like my socks where you have holes in them or something, but holy in the religious sense. If the power comes from God, and that power comes into the king, and there are special ceremonies that make someone a king, once you become a king, you've got a bit of God's power in you, okay? Then you've got a bit of God in you. Therefore, you are sacred, okay? And therefore, even more, these guys, you lot, cannot, for example, attack the king. Because if you resist the king, if you attack the king, if you kill the king or whatever, what you're doing is damaging something sacred. You're going against the church. You're going against God. Okay? You're killing something that has part of God in it. And obviously that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. You will be damned forever, go to hell or something like that. So he takes this religious element and extends it further. Okay? Stresses that these guys, the kings, are sacred representatives of God on earth. They're part of God. They are somehow separate and different from the rest of humanity, closer to God, and they cannot be touched. He also stresses, though, this point that we had before, he also stresses that because kings have got God's power, they should use it to do God's work, to be good. Okay? It doesn't mean they should do anything they want. They don't have arbitrary power. Okay? And God will punish them, as we said before, if they misbehave. Okay? They are sacred, they are representatives of God, they should do what God wants, they should do good things for their nation and in dealing with other people and so on. So again, he's stressing that it's not arbitrary, they can't do anything they wish. Okay, we'll look at both of these guys in more detail next week, but that's a basic introduction to some of their ideas to illustrate this main idea, okay, of the relationship between kings and gods and political power. And this was one of the theories in different forms that we were examining. Let's look a bit at the practice of political power now, okay, and I'll describe this as personal rule. And in a way, we'll examine the word personal in a number of levels. It can be looked at in a number of ways. But firstly, it means to rule personally. Okay? It means to exercise, to use your political power individually. So, what some kings, many kings in this period, believed is that they should not depend on other people for their power, and they should not necessarily give much power to other people. So especially what in English we would call a parliament, okay? A group of other people, whether they are noblemen or whether they are peasant farmers and whatever it is, other people, members of the community who get together and have some power and then can tell the king what to do. No, these guys would say, I rule personally. All decisions will be made ultimately by me. I will use other people to help me. I can't do everything on my own. That's physically impossible. But the rule begins and ultimately ends with me. Okay, the buck stops here, as the Americans might say in that way. Okay, so that's what we mean on one level by personal rule. These guys wanted to use their power, behave, have their influence through their own personal decisions, their own personal government and things like that. They would admit that they are not accountable, responsible to the people, that because of the relationship between them and God, for example, that we've been discussing, God will decide. So I shouldn't have anyone else telling me what to do. I get my power from him, and then I power down to you. So that's one important point, okay? But as we said before, it doesn't necessarily mean personal rule has to be despotic, nasty, evil power. They can be good kings, but they felt that they should be allowed to rule in their own way. However, there were a number of other factors involved. Absolute monarchs, or people who wanted to be absolute monarchs, often had what we would call favourites. Now we know what that word means. Okay, this is my favorite television show. This is my favorite pop band or something like that or whatever. Okay, the thing I like the most. Favorites here means people, and usually men, who are special friends of the king and therefore receive special powers. Okay, so it's not a formal relationship. It's not a paid relationship. You have an office or something. The king will often choose the people he likes, not necessarily his relatives, other people he has a personal relationship with, who he thinks he can trust, and he will give power to them. And we see this today still in many cases, and we saw it in the Middle Ages, and it happened at that time. So if I was David King, Davut Kral, and I decided that my old friend from when I was a boy, Erdem or whatever, okay, I always liked to play with him, we had great times as students, we had great laugh or whatever, so I'll give him lots of money and give him some power and things like that, okay. And that was quite a common thing. Now the problem is that other people resent that. Okay? Other people would say, why is he giving all the things to that Erdem guy? I'm much better than him. And you often get cases of people fighting, or not fighting literally, but trying to push away the favourite. Or else if there's a problem in the country, if things are going badly, they can't blame the king, because the king is sacred and all these things, and it's a bad idea to blame the king. But they can always blame the favourite, say, oh, he's giving the wrong ideas to the king and things like that. So personal rule, without a parliament, without a group of people telling you what to do, but very often they needed help, they needed people to work for them, and part of that often is this use of favourites, use of people to work on their behalf. This guy, now it's years since I made this PowerPoint show, so I can't even remember who this guy was, but he was presumably some favourite from 17th century or whatever, okay. And there's a nice painting showing his power and things. And lastly, for this slide, personality cult. Anyone know what that means? Personal here as in personality, the idea of someone rather than the person, physical person. It means very often you would develop a way of focusing on the idea of the king and making people think the king is special. We still have personality cults in many political systems today, okay, as a way of promoting the ruler. I'm sure if we went to, say, North Korea or somewhere, they would have all pictures of the president of North Korea there, and everyone thinks, oh, what a great guy he is. Sorry?
We have the same thing here, unfortunately.
Right, okay, well, focusing on political leaders and then extending that, making them into something more than they are, okay, in that way, okay, stressing them, and things like that, building up their reputation, their prestige, their image, or whatever, okay. Now, we have all sorts of ways to do this these days with TV and everything like that. They had slightly more limited ways, but they still would try and build up the personality cult. So personal rule here means both ruling personally, but also this idea of the personality cult, presenting the king or queen, usually the king, in a certain way, almost like worship. Okay, cult in English is these kind of pseudo-religions that you get in like the United States, where people suddenly believe that this guy is God or something and disappear off and live in a house with him or something. We don't believe that to be a religion, we call it a cult. It's kind of a religious movement. So it's almost worshipping the king in this sense, okay. And this is another factor, another feature of these things, and it's very important. Okay, let's make a brief start on the next screen. We'll carry on after the break, and then we're going to do something a little bit more fun as well. I hope fun, anyway. Okay, maybe I can get through this one quite quickly, and then we can have our break. We've got about 5 minutes left. Yeah, okay, let's skip through this one quickly, then we'll have a break. Centralization. Okay, you've got the kind of theoretical side. You're focusing on the king. You're focusing on his rule, you're focusing on where he gets his power from. This is all theoretical. How do you make this work? How did they make these things happen in the 17th and 18th centuries? And what we see during this period, and I'm going to talk about this very, very generally, is we see some changes in royal government and administration, okay? And I'll talk about two aspects of this. Firstly, centralization. Before we start, does anyone know where this is? Anyone? Recognize this famous palace at all? Not too far away from Paris, though there it looks very kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's not so much in the middle of nowhere now. It's the Palace of Versailles, okay? And, well, I guess it must have been back in the bicentenary of the French Revolution. My wife and I, before we were married, in fact, there was a big kind of meant to be a big fireworks display and things to celebrate the French Revolution in the grounds of this place. We went there because she was studying in Paris at the time. But a bit like Turkey at the moment, though it was in the summer, there was terrible thunderstorms and rain and things. My memory of Versailles is kind of running away. We didn't get to see very much. But Versailles was the palace set up by Louis XIV, and we'll talk more about him. We've mentioned him already, okay, as the basis for his personal rule, for his court, but also as the basis for his government, okay? And what he was trying to do is centralize political power at this place in a way, and on him in a sense, okay? So what we're talking about here is, firstly, if the king is the center of things, like God is the center of things, then the king needs to have the political system focusing on him too. It's all very well in theory saying, I get my power from God, I make all the decisions, but your country might be massive, thousands of square miles. You can't control everywhere. You need the politics to come in. What had happened before, what was going on, for example, in the Middle Ages, was you had the king. Very often the king was not centered anywhere. The king would spend a large part of the year kind of moving around the country, dealing with the local noblemen and families and things to make sure they're doing what they wanted, collecting some taxes, whatever, then moving on to the next part. So the way people knew about the king, the way people experienced the king's power was because he went to them. Okay, he virtually went round the whole of the country and did a kind of itinerary round the country. So that was the way they did it then. What begins to happen during this period is more and more, they say, okay, let's centralize the power in a capital, in a single place, or whatever. It's going on in the late Middle Ages, and it builds up here. Versailles, I'm using as an example of that. Let's have government focused here. Let's have everything focusing here. Decisions here, we don't have to go out all the time. Okay, that's the first point. It's more efficient and it's easier to control in that way. And the way they did this, it's often very hard. Is that spelled right? Yeah, bureaucracy. Okay, they built up a more informal bureaucratic system. Okay, before, as I said, King David was going to see the Duke Jamberg, okay, the Duke Jamberg somewhere in France or whatever, okay. It was a personal thing. He was a very powerful landowner. He got his power from his family and his land. And I said, okay, you control all the local peasants, all the people here, and pay me some taxes and be a good boy and fight in my army and things like that. And I'll see you again next year. And we go off, and it carries on like that. It's a kind of personal and informal relationship between me as king and him as local power man, in a way. With a bureaucracy, you change that. You make things formal. You have officers. You have trained people who have skills, okay, who know some form of mathematics or whatever that can calculate finances and things like that. Okay, it's becoming more, in our sense, a more professional organization. Okay, so he doesn't have so much power. It's people working in the center who do a lot of the work, in a sense. It's more formal and more professional. And you divide it up into departments, into sections, okay? You give responsibility to some people to work on finances, you give responsibility to other people to work on military issues and things like that. Very much as we have today, okay? It's the beginnings of kind of modern forms of government. And professional people are paid. They are paid a salary to do a job, okay, in the bureaucracy. Whereas the Duke Jamberg was just basically getting taxes from his own peasants and then just working with me, okay? He wasn't given a job and a salary in that sense, okay? It was, again, as we said, more informal. So that's what's going on, and we'll look at a few examples of this in a bit more detail. The problem is, all of this needs money. It all needs taxes to get money. Okay? You can't pay people unless you've got money. You can't build nice buildings and house your government unless you have money to do so. You can't organize it and work in the rest of the country without money. So all of the time, kings needed taxes. They needed ways to get money in order to finance their bureaucracy and their government. And as you make government bigger, as you take away power from the local people, you bring all the power into the center, you get big government, you need more money. Okay? So more centralization, more bureaucracy becomes more expensive. And one of the things that we shall see more than once is that problems between the people and the king, arguments between the subjects and the king, often result from arguments about taxation. Smelly Mel Gibson, the picture right at the start, okay? The American Revolution, or the American Rebellion, as we might call it from a British perspective, okay? Part of that, at least part of that, was to do with taxation. They felt they were paying taxes to the guys over in England, but they were not given any political power. They couldn't send anyone to Parliament, but they were paying taxes to the English monarch and his Parliament. So taxes will come up more than once as a problem. Okay? Governments need to get taxes. We pay taxes all the time. When taxes become too big, people complain, okay? And the kings need taxation. So this is a big issue, one of the big issues here. Big government, big taxes, big problem. Okay, let's have a break, and then we shall do something a little bit different. I'm hoping we shall get some ideas and so on from all of you.